I've always had a fondness for mysteries, especially those that have no apparent answer.
Bigfoot is a legendary creature, also known as Sasquatch, that is said to inhabit forests, mountains, and other wilderness areas in the United States, including Georgia.
In 1985, I had sort of a scare myself as I was trying to recover a lost set of headphones that my parents had bought me for my birthday that year. My first cousins would come and visit, so we walked the horse trails one afternoon and I lost those headphones back there. So as I walked those horse trails by myself, because my cousins could not go, they were busy, I heard something growling and screaming at me in the woods. I heard something run by me with heavy footfalls, and I knew what a horse sounded like as it galloped, and I certainly knew what a bear sounded like. But there were no bears in that wood that we'd ever seen. It wasn't a bobcat scream. I don't know what it was.
Dr. Jeffrey Wells is the author of Bigfoot in Georgia. He is a 10th generation Georgian. He holds a master's in history and is the vice president of online education at Georgia Military College's Global Online Leadership College.
So a couple of months later, I'm watching television, and on comes a series with Leonard Nimoy, who was in Star Trek, and it was called In Search Of. And guess what episode they were running that day? In Search of Bigfoot. And so from that time forward, I have been a big fan of mysteries in general. And of course, being raised in southeast Georgia in those piney woods, where there's lots of weird creatures out there. They're all, scientifically chronicled, however, but they are sort of strange and dangerous. I'd always kind of been interested to see if there really was this, as Dr. Jeff Meldrum calls it, a North American great ape.
Studying Bigfoot is difficult. There have been numerous reports of Bigfoot sightings and encounters, yet there is very little tangible evidence to prove that the creature exists.
Keep in mind that, in 1985, there's no internet. There are no databases that are easily accessible to the inquisitive mind. What you have is you have to research the old-fashioned way, and that's through the library. So what I did was, when I went back to school after seeing the In Search Of television show, now keep in mind, after the event in those woods behind my house, I felt pretty safe for the most part because there was a big field between us, and my bedroom was on the front of the house, it was looking out at the road. So, I kind of thought if there was something out there that was trying to get me, it wouldn't go under all those lights near the street or the road. So I never did think much about it until, again, I saw Leonard Nimoy in Search Of talking about Bigfoot. Now, I also felt a little safer from that because in that show, just like in a lot of shows about Bigfoot, they talk about the Pacific Northwest, which is a long way from Georgia. It's on the other side of the continent. So I never really thought there was anything similar to that in Georgia.
Bigfoot is believed to be an intelligent and elusive creature. It is said to inhabit remote and inaccessible areas of the wilderness, making it difficult to observe.
So how did it come back? How did it manifest itself again? In 2003, I was assigning some research projects to 11th graders in an academic writing class that I taught at a high school in Middle Georgia. And one of the biggest obstacles to getting students, or to teaching English to students, is helping them understand how to do credible research. And an even greater obstacle is getting them interested in writing and researching in the first place. So I used unsolved mysteries to accomplish that. And every year on my list were things like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, Amelia Earhart, the Shroud of Turin. It was a Christian school, so we certainly didn't go so far as to try to get in ghosts and things like that. But we did have students that researched the manifestation of evil and demonic presences. All of that's kind of scary. One young man came up to me and he says, well, I've chosen Bigfoot. He said, but I want to ask you if it's possible to do that research here in Georgia. And I said, well, you probably would get about a paragraph or two. I said, if that thing is even real, it's out in California and Oregon and Washington and maybe in Canada. And he said, oh, well, Mr. Wells, you're wrong. He said, I've had some relatives, we're big hunters, and he said, I've had some relatives that have come back at night and early in the morning when they hunt, and he said they've told some strange stories, and he said, my father and I have heard some things that we question too. So he said, I'd like your permission to take this even further. So we talked about the rules of engagement. In other words, you just don't rely on stories. He wrote me a good paper, and he told me, he said, you ought to turn this into a book. You've always wanted to write a book. Well, it sat in a file. He said, keep the paper. I've gotten the grade for it. That's all I needed. And so it sat in a file, and when I moved up to the Atlanta area, I ran into a young man who had claimed to also have had a Bigfoot encounter. So I went looking for this young man's paper from 2003, and I found it. And I just started building on it and doing my own personal research. And I found out that not too far from where I lived in Metro Atlanta, there was an organization called Georgia Bigfoot. And I began to do a little digging and find out email addresses and phone numbers. And I found these individuals, and I began to call them. So I ran into a couple of people who did interviews on Blog Talk Radio. I believe Robert Morgan was one, and Matthew Pruitt. And I was able to interview some people from the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, the BFRO, the Gulf Coast Bigfoot Research Organization, the GCBRO, and was able to have email conversations and phone interviews with people like Bobby Hamilton, who founded GCBRO, and Matthew Pruitt from the BFRO at the time, Steve Hyde from Georgia Bigfoot, and was able to get some books that were written by a scholar from Idaho State University, because I always believe in going to the scholars too. I'm a scholar, so they're kind of my peeps, if you will.
Some scientists consider the study of Bigfoot to be a pseudo-scientific pursuit. This can make it difficult to secure funding or support for Bigfoot research.
Started reading some of the work of a guy at Idaho State University named Dr. Jeff Meldrum, and I figured a guy whose first name was Jeff ought to be pretty sharp. And later that week, I sat in my car in the parking lot at the college the campus where I taught, same college I'm still at now, and I interviewed him. About an hour and a half interview on the phone. I had to use my car because I couldn't get away from my students. He's a man of science, and he applies scientific principles and scientific inquiry, and that's what we have to do. He recommended, he said, Jeff, now how deep are you into this? And I said, well, right now I'm actually pulling together resources from a lot of places. So I read a couple of his articles he published. I read Sasquatch, The Legend Meets Science, which is the modern Bible, if you will. And he suggested that I pull in material from people like Dr. Grover Krantz, who was one of the four horsemen of Sasquatchery, and that I read some of the books by John Green, Dr. Ralph Bindernagel, and I did. And it was several months. I had my head in a Bigfoot book. So then I began to write my book, collect information. It was over 100 pages long, almost 200 pages. So I began to be convinced that there was some strange phenomena in Georgia. I don't know what it is, but as a scholar, I will say that the research and evidence suggest there is definitely a need for further investigation.
The idea of Bigfoot as a large, humanoid creature living in the forests of North America is thought to have originated from Native American folklore.
In Georgia, before Europeans came here, there were the Cherokee and Creek tribes. Now, keep in mind, those are more modern English names. The reason that we call the Creeks is because they were the people who lived and traveled along or ran along the creek banks. So as we began to investigate, how much legend there is, the Creeks don't have very many legends, but there is one called Estee Chupco. And interestingly enough, the History Channel did a series called Monster Quest and interviewed a couple of people who were native Creek from the Native Creek nations. And Jay McGirt, I believe, was the Native American who is of Creek ancestry, who talked about Estee Chupco in that particular series. That piqued my interest, so I began to do a little bit more research in Native American legend. It's the Cherokees who tend to have more of those legends: Jutakula, Sunyagunyi, and Track Rock Gap, Georgia. That's a bit of a mouthful. There are many scholars who actually believe, and some Bigfoot researchers who believe, that the Native Americans at Track Rock Gap, who were making drawings on the rocks, were actually chronicling things that they'd seen. And some of those images and some of those drawings look desperately like what today people said they see, or they have some resemblance to Bigfoot. And of course, the Cherokee natives, those tribes lived in northeast Georgia up in the mountain areas, and there's one mountain called Blood Mountain that the Cherokee and Creeks, of course, fought over. They call it Blood Mountain for several different reasons. Some scholars suggest it was because of the fighting that took place between the Cherokee and Creeks and the deaths that occurred as a result of that. There are other scholars who say there is a flower that grows that has a blood red appearance on the mountain, and that is why that it is called Blood Mountain. I believe that's in Union County. Apparently there's also a legend of a tribe of people that live on the mountain, and they don't necessarily like intruders. And some people have likened that to modern Bigfoot stories and say, well, that tribe of people from Indian legend that's the Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Native Americans also, they did tell stories about swamp beasts. They told stories about the woolly man or the hairy man in the woods. But we have to be careful about Native American legend, because if we take, and these things do appear in Native American legends, James Mooney, the great chronicler, the great investigator, if you will, and folklorist, who wrote down and investigated a lot of Cherokee legends, wrote down a lot of things that the Cherokees used to say, because they passed along stories orally. They didn't rely on the written word as much as, say, modern Europeans did. Well, we have to be very careful with that, because Native American tribes told legends about a lot of different things. And if every native legend was actually true, then we'd have multi-headed monsters and people with 3 and 4 eyes and giants running all over the place. Cherokee legend tells us that the mountains of Georgia, or mountains, were formed by a great eagle, and the valleys were formed where the eagle's wings touched the earth, and when those wings lifted up, that is what formed the mountains. So we do have to be very careful. Our ancestors, European ancestors and African ancestors, told stories about creation and told stories about why things were and how things came to be, because they all lacked that scientific knowledge. Greeks and Romans told stories. A lot of times myths and legends and religious stories pop up simply because there is no other explanation. So we have to be very careful about taking those legends as truth. But are there Native American legends from both the Creeks and the Cherokees that suggest that they knew of something or thought they saw something? The evidence could be interpreted that way, more so from the Cherokee perspective than the Creek. As a matter of fact, there was one writer, I don't think it was Audubon, but there was one writer who said, after the Europeans had settled what became the original colonies, that a squirrel could go and climb a pine tree in Maine and jump from limb to limb from Maine to Georgia and never touch the ground. The forests were just so rich and lush in this part of the world, so they could have hidden most anywhere in Georgia at the time. Now here's the rub about Cherokee territory: it was mountainous. It's very easy to hide, and it's also very easy to retreat, if you will, into a mountainous terrain. You can easily lose your enemies in those areas. And when Europeans first came here, well, of course, Native Americans traveled the land too. There's this great myth and stereotype out there that Native Americans just stayed in one place and didn't use the land at all. They're human beings. Now, something that is very important to understand is, in the rocks and in nature, you will find things that Native Americans placed to commemorate and visualize what they were seeing in nature and in certain places in the sky. As a matter of fact, not too far from where this interview is taking place is an area called Rock Eagle, and it's a rock formation in the form of an eagle. Also near Putnam in Morgan County. It tended to really center itself right there. There's a formation of a hawk it's been lost, a lot of the rocks, and you can tell it's still there and it's protected, but it's not as visible as Rock Eagle. And then Rock Snake is also not too far from here, and it's almost completely gone, but you can see the outline and the imprint of what was there. So those Native Americans were actually bringing to visualization the things they saw on the ground and in the skies. So I tend to agree with the scholars and the amateur researchers who say that it is possible that the petroglyphs, or Native American, their hieroglyphs, if you will, on the rocks in places like Track Rock Gap and in the canyons and in the mountains of Georgia, maybe they were trying to tell a story about what they saw. It's just up to us to try to figure out what story they were trying to tell based on that evidence. And that is left open to interpretation, and that's where all the fun comes in.
The first documented sighting of Bigfoot was reported in 1811 by British explorer David Thompson. He described large, human-like footprints in what is now the Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada. In the following years, there were scattered reports of similar sightings in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. One of the earliest recorded sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature was in 1840 by the famous frontiersman Daniel Boone, who described a large, hairy-like creature in Kentucky.
In the greater context of legend and folklore that seems to include evidence or characteristics that could fit into Bigfootery or Sasquatchery or Bigfoot and Sasquatch research, I could take you back 1,000 years to Leif Erikson and the Vikings, who came here and set up a settlement, established a settlement that was not permanent. It didn't take. But in their writings, they actually talked about large creatures that stood upright. They thought they were humans, but they were very hairy and shaggy, dark fur, but were big. Now, when you look at that, and you look at that and read between the lines, you could say that fits very much the descriptions that are present in the 17 and 1800s and the 1900s out in the Pacific Northwest, in Texas, in Florida, and of course along the East Coast, where you have sightings of animals that seem to walk upright, are very hairy, and have some humanoid qualities. And so the description that the Vikings gave seems to fit.
Sightings may differ based on the type of terrain in a particular region. Bigfoot is often described as a large, hairy, ape-like creature that moves through the trees. In desert areas, on the other hand, Bigfoot sightings may be less common, and the creature may be described as more human-like in appearance. Climate can also impact Bigfoot sightings. In areas with heavy snowfall, Bigfoot tracks may be more easily visible and could lead to increased reports of sightings. In warmer regions, Bigfoot sightings may be less common due to the creature's reported preference for cooler environments.
Most of your sightings are going to take place between that time and modern times, or at least into the early 1900s, by people who lived in the mountains, by people who lived in rural communities, who lived out in the heavily forested areas on the outskirts of town, those kind of places. You do find in databases across the country, if you pull up small hometown newspapers, you're going to find reports of boogers, demons, devils, wild men, hairy men, swamp apes. Of course, the term Bigfoot is not used until much, much later into the 1900s. And then Sasquatch is a term that is identified in the Pacific Northwest amongst some of those native tribes, and that's picked up by researchers. So today the animal, if it exists, could be called Sasquatch or Bigfoot, or a number of localized names that have appeared. I believe Missouri has the Momo monster, Ohio has the grass man, Florida has the skunk ape. You would have to look far and wide and very close in newspaper reports across the country, and you're going to find some of these stories told. In terms of some of the more popular legends and stories, you have Albert Ostman in the 1920s, who was kidnapped. According to his story, he was taken captive by a family of Sasquatch who he was only able to escape from when he gave them some of his chewing tobacco or snuff. And it caused such a reaction, and I don't blame the Bigfoot if that actually happened. It's disgusting stuff. But they got sick and he was able to escape. I'd say probably one of the most popular stories or one of the most prolific stories that people don't really talk about as much as they do the Patterson-Gimlin footage would be Ape Canyon. And recently, a Bigfoot researcher and historian of sorts has put together, and this is what I like about this, you follow the scientific method, you follow the methods of historical research, and that's what this gentleman has done. He went back into deeds, and he went back into old maps, he went back into mining reports, he went back into government documents, and he thinks that he has found the location where the cabin was during the story that was told about the attack at Ape Canyon over almost a century ago. That one is pretty scary. And again, I don't know what happened. I wasn't there, and I don't know if these things have been recounted through history accurately. But that one would be one of the more popular stories if more people knew about it and read about it. It doesn't have the draw that the Patterson-Gimlin footage does, because that actually is a video that is very, very good, if you will. And lots of professionals in the videography world, in the photography world. They've had physicists, they've had people who are experts in biomechanics, they've had zoologists, they've had just mainstream biologists, people who are very familiar with that part of the world, to look at that video, and none of them can really reach a definitive conclusion. So that evidence is still extremely popular, and it's extremely well debated. Ape Canyon would have been a lot more dangerous because this was actually an attack by what the miners say was a tribe of Bigfoot, or a family of them. One of them was shot and killed and fell off into the canyon, and the miners think that this was retribution, which tells you that if these stories are true, these animals are tribal, much like humans. And as far as the 1800s, we have a story from 1829 in the Okefenokee swamp that sits on, the area was actually on the Florida side, but these men were also from Georgia. It's kind of a Georgia-Florida story. There were giant hairy monsters that were told to be in the Okefenokee swamp. And a group went out in search, or a group ran into these animals because for some reason they were hunting them. I don't know why you'd hunt something like that. If it's real, it's dangerous. And the camp that night was attacked. A few people were killed, and only a couple of men made it out of the swamp alive. If that story is true and has been told accurately, that's another Ape Canyon-like attack. In 1955, Joseph Whaley in Terrell County, Georgia, in the southwestern part of the state, not too far from Albany, near an area called Kinchafoonee Creek. Well, Kinchafoonee Creek is alligator infested. It was at the time in 1955, and a young man who was about 20 years old named Joseph Whaley was working for the Georgia Forestry Commission. And for some reason, he was sent near Kinchafoonee Creek with a skiff. And I'm sure that everyone knows that is like the sickle, that it's a blade you cut vegetation, and you could cut down vines and things like that with. I have no idea why he was out there, A, alone, and B, in that thicket, cutting down bush and brush with a blade. But he was. So he pulled his Jeep up, parked it nearby him, and he went to work, and he heard some grunting and growling. And of course, everyone is curious. Interestingly enough, humans tend to run to the danger more so than run away from the danger. Joseph Whaley, I guess, had an inquisitive mind, so he goes into the thicket to see what was causing the noise. And as he goes into the thicket, it jumps out at him. And he describes it, it's very weird, a 6-foot, gray-haired creature that had tusks and pointed ears, and long arms but very small hands, standing up on 2 feet. And so, of course, seeing something like that, he hightails it back to his Jeep, Now, interestingly enough, the first thing that he attempts to do is get on the radio and signal the local ranger station and the authorities. Now, if something 6 foot tall with tusk and pointy ears is growling and yelling and screaming and chasing me on 2 feet, that's the last thing I plan to do. So he gets into the vehicle and he can't get anybody back at the ranger station, so he decides, I'll get in the truck and leave. So he climbs into the driver's side and he puts his keys in the ignition, and this thing is already, according to Joseph Whaley, has made it around to the driver's side and reaches through the window and is trying to pull him out and attack him. And in the hustle and bustle and in the fight, Joseph gets his shoulder scratched, and there are 3 deep claw wounds on his shoulder. So he decides that if he's going to survive the day, he'd better get out of there. So he throws his keys down in the Jeep and climbs out the passenger side, hits the asphalt, and runs into the woods with whatever this thing is in hot pursuit. Well, Joseph is 20 years old and he's scared, adrenaline is flowing, so he's able to outrun this thing. And when he keeps looking back and he's outpacing it, so then he decides to circle back and lose whatever this is, and he circles back and gets to his Jeep, picks up his keys, puts them in the ignition, and I'm sure that he was quite proud and relieved when the Jeep cranked, and he hightails it to the ranger station. He reports the incident to the ranger on duty, and that gentleman's name is Jim Bowen. Now, Jim Bowen does see some evidence of what Whaley is talking about. There are the scars, and they treat them. And Joseph Whaley is out of breath, like he's been in a fight. So Jim Bowen goes back to the scene on Kinchafoonee Creek. And there is, he says in his report, there was something that happened there. There was evidence of a scuffle. And there was, of course, evidence of something big that had walked through those woods. Then they report it to the sheriff. Now, the sheriff has an interesting take, and so does the GBI, the director of the GBI, who was investigating the case. His role, I don't understand why the director of the GBI was involved in such a case, but his name was Agent Jones. So Agent Jones says, well, what this was a farmer, more than likely a farmer who had dressed up in a costume because they knew of a farmer in that area who was angry because people, young men and teenagers and other people would come and fish in his private lake on his property without his permission and catch all his fish. You know, Southerners, especially those who live in rural communities, tend to be very possessive of their property. We tend to be very friendly and we'll let you fish and hunt on our property if you ask. But apparently he was mad because these people were not asking permission. So he got a Halloween costume and mask and dressed up and started apparently scaring off the intruders. Agent Jones said that was more than likely what it was. The other explanation that Agent Jones has is that it was a hog bear. I was born and raised in the South, and I don't know what a hog bear is. His description of what a hog bear was a bear in Georgia that was smaller than a grizzly. And I still don't understand how that was walking upright on 2 feet, chased a guy to a Jeep, had tusks and pointy ears. I know bears sometimes have pointy ears, but I don't know of one that has tusks like a hog. So apparently there is a creature out there called the hog bear that I didn't know anything about. Joseph Whaley kind of fades from memory. You know, you don't hear anything else from him. But that report shows up in the local paper. It attracts the attention of the United Press, UPI, who sends a reporter there. It shows up in the reports of the Georgia Forestry Commission, and I believe it's also in the reports of the GBI. And it gets a lot of attention in 1955 and a few years after that down around Kinchafoonee Creek. So you've had several people that have reported on it, given it some attention. Rob Morphy from Cryptopia. It shows up in Jim Miles' the Haunted South Georgia book. I've got it in the Bigfoot in Georgia book and on my blog. I would say that one and the Okefenokee occurrence again, if these are actual incidents that happened and not misidentifications, those are two of the biggest and, to me, the scariest episodes if they're true.
Bigfoot is described as a large, hairy, bipedal humanoid creature with a height ranging from 6 to 10 feet tall and weighing between 500 to 1,000 pounds. Bigfoot is covered in dark or reddish-brown hair with longer hair on the head and shoulders. Despite its animalistic features, Bigfoot is often described as having a human-like appearance with broad shoulders, long arms, and a flat face.
Well, when you read the different books from the state of literature out there, we are told by those who have done credible research and read into the details of the sightings that these animals in the southeast tend to be, if they exist again, tend to be smaller. So what's been described out in the Pacific Northwest tends to be a larger, stronger, more virile form of whatever creature this could be. The versions that you find in Florida and Georgia and in parts of the southeast either tend to be smaller or they tend not to be as big in various forms. I've even heard some people say that they don't think they're as broad-shouldered. They think they may be lankier, that they may stoop over a little bit more. There's some discrepancy about the prints, the footprints, how many toes they have, how many digits. The morphology is a little different. Also, one of the things that I have seen is, yes, a lot of these sightings do take place in the North Georgia mountains and in the mountainous regions of the southeast, but you also see a lot of these sightings take place around the riverbeds. You even see, I have collected a lot of research and a lot of reports where people have seen these things near farmland. I will tell you a story. I have since learned that the lady who told me this story has passed away. But it was at Thanksgiving 1963, and she remembered this very vividly, her mother telling the story, and her mother remembered the date vividly because it happened around the time President Kennedy was assassinated. Okay? And that happened on November 22nd, 1963. So this event happened somewhere right in there. So the father died. He had a massive heart attack. And it was just her and her mom. And her mom was a nurse. And the daughter went on to nursing school, actually, and took up the profession after her mother. So her mother was in the kitchen cooking what would eventually, I guess, be Thanksgiving, or it may have been something after Thanksgiving. I'm not sure. She was heating up leftovers or something. But she was in the kitchen on the back side of the house. The lady who was telling me the story said, I was in what was really a crib or playpen, if you will, on the front side of the house. And she said, my mother had the playpen near a window in the living room. And they were out there on this farmland by themselves. And the mother, I think, was trying to keep up the farmland as best as she could. And they were way away from their next door neighbor a good piece. And she said that in the story, the mother said she started crying. The baby started crying pretty bad. So she was in there at the kitchen with the stove, so she decided to walk in and check on her daughter. And when she walked in to check on her daughter, she said she saw something out the window. Of course, shades and blinds were not very common in the 1960s. This is 1963 in rural southwest Georgia. And she said, my mother told me that when she went to the window, she saw what was a humongous hairy man standing in the front yard. And she said, as my daughter cried even louder, it got closer and closer. And then when she went in and was able, it didn't see her. When she was able to get in front of the window to investigate further, it was almost at the window. It was right there. And she said that her house was built a little off the ground and the window was up off the floor. So she said when this thing stood looking at me, she said its head was almost at the top of the window. So this thing had to be about 8.5 feet tall. The mother quickly grabs the child, the daughter who's telling me the story now some years later, and she goes to the back of the house and gets her husband's rifle. And by the time she gets back to the front yard, it's gone. And she said that her mother told her there was a dilemma there. Do I stay in that house and possibly come under attack? I don't know what this is. And she said her mother told her at the time, remember this is in the throes of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King is still 5 years away from assassination. Her mother told her, I didn't know whether to leave the house or stay. So she finally decided it would be best to get to her neighbor's house. So she grabbed her daughter and the shotgun, and she said, I remember Mother telling me that the first thing she did was dash out the door and hit the screen door so hard that it broke one of the pieces of wood that attached. The frame came unhinged, and they had to repair that. She said, Mother said I had to repair that afterwards, but she said, I had you in one arm and the rifle on in my other arm. And she said, I remember screaming out. She said, Mother said, I remember screaming out really loudly, if you think you're going to harm me and my family, I got something to show you won't, Sounds about like, that sounds right. That sounds about right. And she said that she got down, it took them a while. She said, Mother said we had to trudge through farmland and thicket. And she said we finally got to our neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and they were concerned. This is 1963. They took her in their home, said, you just stay here you stay here. You don't go back home. And she said that her mother told her, remember now, she's a baby. Her mother told her that they stayed there overnight because the mother, the elderly lady that took them in, she and her husband were scared that it would come back. Now, the story she told, she said, this was surprising to my mother. And she said, I'm a woman of science myself. So she said, this is a shocking part of the story. She said, the elderly couple kept saying, it may come back. We don't want it back around here. Which leads both me and the woman who told the story to believe that they had encounters themselves. That's scary. Now, when you think about it and you dig down into this thing, why did it come to the window? Why was the crying of the child, why did it attract it? I've been told that could mean two things. Now, Bobby Hamilton with the Gulf Coast Bigfoot Research Organization said that when he was a child, a young man, that one came to his bedroom window and was luring him by doing that. It's a very human feature, like come here, and was almost smiling at him, wanting him to come to that window. And he said, I believe in an interview not long ago, that his brother had actually had some of that same stuff happen to him in that bedroom. That's dangerous. The other side of this is I've been told by Bigfoot researchers that these animals, again, if they are real, are attracted to the sounds of crying children because they're curious and want to investigate and possibly want to help. I don't know, but it scared the daylights out of this woman, and eventually they did sell the house and moved away. As a matter of fact, the phone call came from Boston, Massachusetts.
Bigfoot is known for leaving behind large footprints, typically measuring 16 to 18 inches in length, with a distinctive stride pattern. Bigfoot is known to be shy and elusive, avoiding contact with humans and hiding in remote areas in the forest. Many witnesses have reported a strong, unpleasant odor in the vicinity of Bigfoot sightings, often described as a mix of wet dog and skunk.
But even here in Georgia, there are some common characteristics. There are some common things that you hear in some of these reports. In some instances, the reports say that whatever this animal is maintains a distance. It's almost like they're observing. The description of the animal tends to be very similar. Now, down on Kinchafoonee Creek, Joseph Whaley, it's become known as the gray ghost of Kinchafoonee Creek. And I just recently put up a post about it on my blog because it's gotten some attention lately. That is the only one I know of in Georgia where the animal had that light-colored fur. But in most of the reports, the animal seems to be very curious about human, but not all of them. Some of them, they just happen upon the animal. But in many instances, the reports indicate that whatever this is very curious about human behavior. or is monitoring human behavior. But the animals always have fur, the animals are always tall, the animals are always bipedal. However, it's also important to understand some reports indicate that when the animal becomes frightened or seems to want to attack, that they will go down on all, that we have heard that, they go down on all fours and speed away. I have read some of those reports, but that's not as common as the bipedalism. Some other common traits, they are in wooded areas. They are along major water thoroughfares such as creeks or rivers. They are in areas where there tends to be lots of wildlife. And that makes a lot of sense. If these animals are real, they've got to eat. They feed upon different things that they can find in the woods. Now, I have read reports, not just in Georgia, but nationwide, that these animals have been known to attack family pets. There have been some reports, especially around the rural areas, where and in the mountains, where animals are kept in the backyard in pens, or animals are kept in the backyard like a dog on a chain, a family pet that they go out and get and play with, but otherwise they chain it up in the back so it can run around without escaping. That they get up and those animals are missing. And there are some Bigfoot researchers who've told us that they've left prizes out. They've left things for these animals, such as buckets of blueberries or strawberries, or they've shot a deer and they've left it laying out in the woods, or they've left fruit, a bag of apples, most common. And in some reports, you don't see this very often, but in some reports, those things will be missing. They turn out to be gone, and then something is left in its place, like little things made out of twigs or roots, or things that are made out of twigs, almost like offerings. However, we also see that there are reports where these animals are dangerous. Bobby Hamilton, of course, the Kinchafoonee, the gray ghost of Kinchafoonee. We've had hikers in the along the Appalachian Trail, in the mountains of North Georgia, who said that they felt threatened and attacked. A lot of reports come in, and a lot of the trackers and investigators say that these animals will actually defend their territory, but that most often what they do is they scare humans to try to get them out of their territory, because they really don't want to be discovered and bothered. We have to very much understand that if these animals are indeed real, that they are still animals, and they would have to be treated as such. And there needs to be scientific inquiry. There needs to be zoological inquiry. We need to understand if these things are real, how they interact with humans, the potential for them to be dangerous, what their native territories are, the ecology, what greater context they exist in the environment, and how to protect them if indeed they are real. And I believe the research and the evidence and investigation that so far exists suggests that there needs to be more scientific inquiry. The evidence, the scientific process needs to be applied to see if there really is something that we have yet to discover. And I believe that when people are doing this, there are a lot of people out there that are interested in this because it's a mystery. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with someone who goes out into the woods safely and looks around. There's nothing wrong with people who read scientific journals and try to apply scientific principles to the information quest. There's nothing wrong with that. But we have to make sure that we treat it in that regard. You don't just automatically assume if you hear something that goes bump in the night that it's a ghost or Bigfoot. This is so often overused, and I hate to use this here, but it's Occam's razor, and people will throw that terminology out there a good bit when it doesn't even need to go to that level. But Occam's razor says that the simplest solution is usually the solution, and that's true in those cases. But you have to also understand this. It's not even about Occam's razor. Some people create mystery and uncertainty for themselves. Case in point, when I first got my book, when my book was published and I got the author's advance copies and then the gratuity copies to give away to family and friends, I stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning in the little house we lived in metropolitan Atlanta. And what I'd done is I'd made a little office inside my master bedroom. Well, my back, when I sat at the desk, faced the 2 back windows in the master bedroom. The master bedroom windows faced the backyard. The backyard was one of over 100 in the subdivision that I lived in a larger city in metropolitan Atlanta. That is certainly not ground zero for a Sasquatch. Okay. Burglars? Yes. Sasquatch? No. So as I was reading the book, there were some stories that began to kind of scare me. This is a book I wrote and researched. So as I'm sitting there, I remember feeling kind of scared, and I got up and went to those windows and pulled the shades because I didn't want anything looking in on me. And then I stood there as I walked halfway across the bedroom, and I thought, now what did I just do that for? And I said, did this book create paranoia and fear in my mind? Or was it really the need to feel safe? When you and I were talking the other day and I came home, I came into this bedroom and I got the book out again to prepare for this interview. And I pulled a couple of other books off the shelf because some of the questions you had talked about the greater context of the legend. So I was brushing up on it. Well, there's some scary stories out there. True or false, I don't know, but they are scary. So as I got up to go to the kitchen to make myself a cup of coffee, we always have to read a good book with a cup of coffee. I heard things that were quite usual in the house. My sister-in-law was watching TV in her bedroom, and I heard her moving around in there, and I heard some things that were normal in the backyard. But because I'd been reading those books, I got scared. So psychologically in your mind, I don't even think we have to take it to Occam's razor. I think we don't even have to say the simplest solution is the solution. I think sometimes psychologically we conjure up a mysterious universe in our own minds. And it's the environment that we live in sometimes in our own mind that creates that fear and paranoia. Currently, I am undertaking a study and I'm trying to contact as many people who have made Bigfoot reports, Sasquatch sighting reports as I can, and not that I don't believe them. It's not that I don't. I just want to find out, did you ever read anything about Bigfoot or Sasquatch before you made the report? Have you ever read anything on social media or the internet? What kind of books did you read? Because I want to find out and then I want to look at the details of the cases and see, is there anything that might have precipitated this? Maybe this was fear and paranoia in your own mind, and that Occam's razor can be applied, but because of what all you'd read and everything maybe you'd seen on television, did you watch documentaries? And they're all great, and there are a lot of people who tell believable stories, but I also believe that there are some people who go out there and they go looking for something, or they go into what is a normal environment. Average, everyday environment, the woods, the backyard, down by the river, they're at the lake fishing, and they see something, and it automatically triggers the thought process that those memories of what they read or they saw on television, it triggers, and then they begin to apply that to what they experienced, when maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe it was just a tall, hairy guy. Or maybe it was nothing at all. So inside our minds sometimes we do get on that level. So we have to be very careful in applying the scientific principles and the rules of logic and reason and psychology to what we've seen. There's something else too that we have to be very aware of, and that's our own background. I was raised in part by a great-grandmother, and of course she died when I was about 5 years old, but before I went to kindergarten, my great-grandmother would tell me, if you don't behave, the boogeyman will get you, or the moo cow. I was scared of cows for years. Well, that psychologically is imprinted in your mind. What is the boogeyman? And scholars tell us from around the world that if you look at legends and stories, if you look at the study of monsters, even in literature, that a lot of monsters actually are a manifestation of our greatest fears. Look at what a fire-breathing dragon is. Okay. In those days, you know what there was no fire department in the medieval age. One spark would take your house completely out because most of them had thatch roofs, and they were built in a way where a fire just would salivate over that. A spark would just salivate to take that out because it was kindling for a fire. So a fire-breathing entity that flew when we had to walk on the ground that looked like a snake with a forked tongue and a tail, those are the images of our greatest fears: fire, snakes, and predators from the air. So we also have to be very careful that we don't project those fears and images on things that we do naturally see that are nothing more than common, average, everyday occurrences.
The idea of an undiscovered species of primate living in the wilderness is inherently intriguing and mysterious. For many people, the possibility of encountering Bigfoot adds an element of excitement and adventure to exploring the outdoors. For some, the belief in Bigfoot is part of a broader connection to nature and the natural world. The belief in Bigfoot is a rejection of traditional scientific or governmental authority. The idea that there may be a large, undiscovered primate living in the wilderness challenges the notion that we know everything there is to know about the world around us.
I'm a very spiritual person, and I do believe in an afterlife, and something is out there. I'm arrogant enough as a human being and selfish enough to want it to go on, and I will contemplate life after death a lot, because this just can't be it, because there are so many mysteries out there that if there is an afterlife and there is a supreme being who's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent, I want to ask, whatever it is, who really shot JFK? I want to know. I want him or her, whatever, to let me take some sort of this invisible form. I want to go see Bigfoot. If he's real, take me to him.